Hey guys, today's story is about a new player that metagames and just is overall a pretty crappy person. Before I begin, I would like to have just some context on myself that I feel is relevant to the story. I have Asperger's, clinical OCD, and PTSD from years of emotional and mental abuse and gaslighting, and typically try to use D&D as an escape from that. I will thus usually try to find a way to compromise with someone and avoid conflict at any cost, since verbal conflict is especially one of my gripes. And a little bit of a note, this is going to be a long one, so apologies. A few months ago, I started a campaign in a homebrewed steampunk setting at our local game store, and I'm really passionate about world building, and I wanted to share this unique experience with others. Come Session 0, I had 3 initial players, with a 4th joining for Session 1, and they're not too relevant to this story, so I'll not really focus too much on them. All of them, however, were either brand new, or relatively speaking, to D&D, but at least all of them did some reading up on the game and understood the basics. In contrast, I had been DMing for at least 4 years at that time. Enter stage left, the problem player. I used to know the person about 5 or 6 years ago, but we had basically drifted apart the moment we left high school, and at a small gathering of our high school class, he and I started talking about D&D, and I mentioned that I was running a new campaign. He showed interest in the campaign, but was hesitant to join, seeing as he has 0 experience with the game. I said that was fine, seeing as the majority of the party were also inexperienced, and that he could join our next session. And this was my first mistake, since I somehow didn't think that the reasons our acquaintanceship broke apart so fast would be relevant, and I was wrong. Come next session, he arrived late to the game, and as we have to rent out our space, it's not like we could just play a little bit later to accommodate this, and to add on to this, we still needed to make his character. I had already sent him information on the classes, races, and basic character creation info, but it still took another 20 to 30 minutes of the session time to set up his character. And with his character finally set up, the session started, and it was going fairly well initially. He engaged with the other players, and roleplayed, and seemed to be getting the gist of the game. That is, however, until the party started an encounter with some human traffickers. His character, and the party cleric, weren't with the others when the combat started, so the first few rounds of combat went smoothly and fairly quickly. And this all came to a head when his character, which was a caster, and the cleric joined the combat. What followed was a 20-minute debate of myself, and eventually the rest of the party, trying to explain how spell slots worked, and for some reason, he, an avid RPG lover, couldn't understand the concept of spell slots, despite all the methods we tried to explain it to him. And then, the session ended for the night, and we all went our separate ways for the weekend. So obviously, I was surprised when I got a private message from him the next day, berating and scolding me for making him look stupid in front of the whole party, because apparently, me trying to help a new player understand the basic rules without ever becoming rude or mocking was me trying to make him look stupid. And after some arguing, this situation got resolved, and I silently hoped that this would be the last of such arguments. And I was wrong, again. When the next session came along, he couldn't make it, as he was exposed to the virus and was keeping safe. And because the session started in combat, I had him be present via a Discord call. The combat continued relatively okay, until we got to his turn again. First, he refused to take any offensive action, or support role, to aid in fighting the enemies, because his character, which was a lawful good sorcerer, didn't know if these people were good or bad. They were human traffickers, so it's not too hard to guess. Secondly, he took about 3 to 5 minutes to do his turns, so after his turn, I just mentioned to the party again that a turn is technically just 6 seconds, so they should try and keep some of their thought processes shorter. I mentioned this as some of the others had also been taking too long to just decide to attack the enemy in front of them. Eventually, combat concluded with 2 of the enemies as captives. His character then used his spells to heal one of the captives, despite the party paladin having taken quite a beating. Not too much else happened during the session. The store had to close early, so we lost an hour of gameplay because of it, and everyone seemed to enjoy the rest of the session. Color me surprised when I got another long text message from him, telling me that he didn't appreciate being called out in front of the whole group and that I will respect him in the future. I tried to point out that the remark about the pacing, which was the only potentially wrong thing I could recall from the session, was directed to everyone, not just him, and I even waited until after everyone's turns to make it, and no one else seemed to mind it at all. And he made claims that I was flaunting and asserting my authority over him, and this will become a common theme in the arguments to follow, and that I'm patronizing him for not knowing the rules. Eventually, I just tried to change the topic from that argument, and I tried to move on. For the next 2 weeks, which was a few days before Christmas, and then a week after New Year's, our group didn't have sessions, but I continued to talk to all of my players. And during one of these conversations with him, which was on alignment, I apparently made the blunder of saying that lawful good couldn't technically exist in the manner that it does in fantasy settings, in our real world. And what followed was an over 2,000-word wall of text from him, trying to prove how I was wrong and clueless, and how he is definitely more right about this, and some sort of paragon of virtue. I tuned out about a quarter of the way through that, and just ignored him for a few days before continuing with a different topic. Our next session was online, as the store was closed for the whole of January, and it was mainly a shopping session, but it also involved interrogating the 2 cultist spies. And during this whole session, he kept calling the paladin a destructive and chaotic force that his character was scared to be around, and I could tell that the paladin's player was not liking this constant picking on his character. He also tried directly controlling what the other players could or could not do, even going so far as to ask for persuasion checks and initiative rolls to counter what the other players were doing. He also kept fixating on the one trafficker they had captured, the one he had healed, and used every opportunity he could to bring up how he must protect this character from the other players who wanted to kill him. But none of the other players even cared about the NPC anymore, and although he didn't send a complaint or argument after the session, several of the other players did message me to ask him to stop his behavior. And the party had downtime now after the interrogation, so I decided to wait until after his downtime. Come the next session, and I had yet to bring it up with him, and where the other players had all finished their one-on-one downtime in 2 or 3 days, his took over a week, and he ended up doing less than most of them. And in this session, they were planning on attacking the ruined temple in which the cultists were set up, and after at least 15 minutes of him going on about all the spells that he had, or some other tangent, he straight up metagamed and said, "Oh, we don't have to worry about these enemies. They won't have their actions or special resistances." To which I simply responded, "Your character wouldn't know that. That's meta-knowledge." And after the session, he complained that I had some sort of vendetta against him, and that him quoting the monster manual and enemy stat blocks didn't count as meta-knowledge. And when I pointed out to him that I was merely trying to keep the roleplay alive and that he was, in fact, metagaming, he started saying that it was my fault that he had to do all of these things, and that I'm making him a bad person. And only when I mentioned the complaints from the other players of him actively trying to control them, or go against their characters, or say things about their characters that are making them uncomfortable, did he cease his attack. And for those of you who have gotten this far, and wonder why I hadn't asked him to leave by this point, I had considered it, but unfortunately, his words were getting to me. As I've had a lot of experience with being gaslit most of my life, it made me feel guilty in a way, and I felt that it would have been wrong or somehow my fault if he left, even with all these people telling me to remove him from the party. And to move on to the next session, which was our second to last one, he appeared to have been tempered. RP was going smoothly, combat was moving along well, etc. And thus, my defenses were somewhat down when our latest session happened. By now, they were in the temple, passing by several cells of kidnapped townsfolk, and all the casters were low on spell slots, and the druid and barbarian NPC with them each only had one wild shape and rage left for the day, and they decided against long resting before entering the temple's lowest floors. They passed by a room with some bookworms, which were a homebrew creature that's kind of like a rust monster, but for scrolls and paper, and they were there, devouring a few books. And though his character wanted to fight them, the rest of the party convinced him that they could always come back later. And they entered an officer's quarters for several cultists and defeated them fairly easily, and the druid, artificer, and paladin started to loot the corpses, and I had them roll to see if they found anything of value on them. And then the problem player very clearly asked, "Can I inspect the table?" And when I called for an investigation check, the cleric asked if he could also roll. The problem player ended up rolling a 4, whereas the cleric rolled a 24. And I told the problem player that he found nothing of value or of use on his side of the table. And then told the cleric what he found, which was some blue quartz, several stacks of clean parchment and inkpots, and 2 black pearls. And the cleric gave the parchment, inkpots, and 2/3 of the quartz stones to the problem player, but kept the pearls. And the party, being pressed for time, didn't spend so much time to divide the loot equally, and the session ended as they entered combat in the inner sanctum. Fast forward to 2 days after our previous session, and I'm exhausted of difficult and argumentative players, and he posts a message in our Discord server and started dividing up the loot that the cleric, not he, found, but also said that he was keeping the pearls for himself because they're very valuable, and he quoted their values as listed in the DMG. I jokingly made a comment that that's if the merchant he tried selling them to was honest and by the book. But I also asked him personally, "Didn't the cleric find the pearls? Not you?" However, this question, along with our joking and casual comment on his message in the group, set him off again. And to sum up his rant, he claims that I just DM so I can assert my authority over others, and how I constantly pick on him and disrespect him, and patronize him because I made a joke about the merchants of my world. He also said that it was unfair that he got nothing from a failed investigation check, and then tried retconning what had happened, and how the cleric found the gems and not him. He also complained that he was an outsider in this party of in-real-life strangers, and that because of this, his character's wishes weren't being respected, and that I'm obviously encouraging the other players to be like this. And obviously upset by these rants and accusations, I tried to ignore it, but unfortunately my brain formed an obsession around these attacks on my person, and the more I fought against it, the more I became anxious and compelled to answer. Inevitably, I caved, and tried to civilly respond to his accusations. This, however, led to an over 3,000-word response of him trying to prove how much more of an intellectual he is over me, and patronizing me because my vocabulary and grammar weren't perfect, and he threw blatant personal attacks to prove why he was right, and basically tried to guilt-trip me because I was asking for advice on how to deal with such situations from other people, and how doing so proved that my arguments were weak and needed validation from other people. He ended this by trying to manipulate me into keeping him in the game, and how I would be a bigot if I kicked him. My passion has always been to help people, and in D&D, that translates into me helping others, especially new players, understand the rules of the game, or even just the rules of my particular campaign. However, his toxic behavior has caused that passion of mine to feel like something corrupted and wrong, and all the time I spend fending off his attacks, I could have spent on making the other new players become more passionate about the game. I'm still going to try to run this campaign with the rest, but his behavior has left a stain on it, and D&D as a whole for me that won't easily go away. Well guys, something that's important is to vet your players. I don't know if this guy did vet or how much good vetting this person would have really done, but it does help slightly. And asking for help from other people is not exactly a bad thing, especially if you aren't sure if you are being over dramatic on something. And as per usual for these types of stories, the OP should have kicked this guy ages ago, but mistakes were made and lessons learned. As for this problem player himself, I would say that he's a bit of a narcissist with a victim complex or some such, or at the very least knows how and probably enjoys screwing with people to get his way. Hopefully the OP can enjoy D&D in the future with his party and get over this little stain. But in any case, that's the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, maybe think about subscribing and staying tuned for future videos. But, as always, have a good one.